And these are the more current of our radical sisters. In the beginning, we heard, okay, all I want to say is I did get a book about Ruth Gruber, and somehow because my sister-in-law is cleaning out her closet and having the house painted, I ended up with a book. So it's going to go into the Bethel Library soon on Ruth Gruber. Okay, so I just want to welcome you all back. Hadassah, as we know, their top priorities center around advocating for the well-being of women and reinforcing Jewish values, steadfast in our fight against anti-Semitism and hate. And who would have thought that we'd be feeling that kind of closeness to it again? And also, one of the programs is their Reconceiving Infertility and DNA programs. I want to just get started. I mean, we're going to hear tonight about Gloria Steinem, Judy Chicago, and Deborah Lipstadt, who I'm familiar with. She speaks on the anti-Semitism type program. So Barbara, please go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you all for being here on this rainy night. I guess it's raining everywhere. And let me start to share my screen.
And while that's happening, Barbara, if I might, please remind everyone to mute. Thank you so much.
Okay, whoops. No, I'm gonna go back. Can you all see this, I hope? Okay, the topic tonight is contemporary Jewish women. 3 women, Gloria Steinem, Judy Chicago, Deborah Lipstadt, who are definitely rebels, radicals, and reformers, and who are all still with us today, making their mark, having an impact on American life, and leading the way. In 1972, the same year that Shirley Chisholm ran for president, ran for the Democratic nomination to the presidential ticket, and the same year that Sally Prison became the first woman rabbi ordained in the United States, a new magazine appeared. It was called simply Ms., MS, on purpose, not indicating whether a woman was married or not, but simply calling her Ms., as we say, Mr. The main force behind this new magazine, which sold out 30,000 copies in the first 8 days, was a journalist named Gloria Steinem. Ms. Magazine catapulted her onto the national stage, the world stage. She became a symbol of the women's movement in journalism and the women's movement more generally. And in many ways, she still is today. She's controversial, she's outspoken, she's articulate, she's a rebel, a radical, and a reformer, all of them. You would not have predicted any of this from her early childhood and background. She was born to a family struggling through the Depression in 1934 in Toledo, Ohio. This is a photograph of her father, Leo, who was Jewish. Her mother was not. Her father drifted through many jobs in the 1920s, and by the 1930s, like many other people in Toledo, which had an unemployment rate of 50% at the height of the Great Depression, he could not find work. It was a hard time for the family. Gloria's mother, Ruth, had worked for the Toledo newspapers before 1929, but the insecurity of the Depression and the family's serious financial situation took its toll on her mental stability. She was hospitalized with a nervous breakdown right before Gloria was born, and she would suffer from mental illness through the rest of her life. Leo finally converted an old lodge in Michigan into a summer camp, a summer resort, and it was fairly successful. It was there that Gloria learned to tap dance. But during the rest of the time, the family was on the road, living in a trailer, as you can see here. This is a picture of Gloria with her mother. That meant that as Leo traveled around the country trying to sell antiques, Gloria hardly ever attended school in one place for more than a few weeks at a time. She was largely taught by Ruth, and she had no friends. By the early 1940s, the family was separated. Leo was on the road full time, and in 1945, they divorced. That meant essentially that Gloria, with her mother in Toledo, as a 10-year-old, was in charge of housekeeping and cooking. For a time, she will tell you, they lived in a rat-infested farmhouse. She eventually worked part-time in a department store, and she would tap dance at night at men's fraternal organizations for $10. Finally, in her senior year, she went to live with her older sister, Suzanne, in Washington, and attended Western High School, which was an excellent school. She had always been an avid reader. She was a fine student, and like her sister, won a scholarship to Smith College. And this is a photo of Gloria Steinem at Smith College. She describes Smith College as a dream come true. She was popular. She majored in government and foreign policy studies. She excelled from the very beginning at writing, graduated magna cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa. She had become engaged in college. Remember, that was the norm in the 1950s. And she discovered she was pregnant, but she was unsure really about getting married. So she went off to England for an abortion because, of course, abortion was illegal in the United States at that time. She then won a fellowship to study the political system and culture of India, went to India, really liked what she saw, wrote about it, became very interested in the whole concept of nonviolence and the issue of class distinctions. Came back, moved to New York, and began pounding the pavements to try and get a job as a journalist. Her first job, she worked for a humor magazine called Help. And the very first signed article she produced was for Esquire magazine, and it was called, quote, "The Moral Disarmament of Betty Coed," unquote. It was about recent advances in birth control. But she had trouble getting assignments for hard news stories, and that's what she really wanted to write about. So in 1963, very famously, she went undercover to work at a Playboy club. By this time, Hugh Hefner's empire was enormous and successful. The Playboy clubs were the talk of the town. There were millions of people reading Playboy magazine. Gloria Steinem posed as Marie Catherine Oakes, and she worked at a Playboy club for 3 weeks. First as a hat check girl, and then as a waitress. When she was finished, she wrote a 2-part series called A Bunny's Tale. A Bunny's Tale. It was a very clever piece and revealed the unglamorous side of being a Playboy bunny. 8 hours on your feet, 3-inch heels, a humiliating physical exam, having to stuff things into your bra to give you the bust they wanted. working around those heavy platters. And of course, you never made the wages that you were promised. This two-part series made her very known in New York. But still, she was relegated to writing human interest and women's stories for magazines like Glamour. Here she is as a young journalist. She was really on the periphery of the women's movement until later in the decade. And during this time, she was writing for comedy shows. She was writing articles on cooking and such. Only now and then a serious piece. In 1968, she and a friend, Clay Felker, decided to found something called New York Magazine, and she began to cover political topics. Would you believe that Gloria Steinem interviewed First Lady Pat Nixon? She interviewed Eugene McCarthy. She interviewed Robert Kennedy. And at the same time, she went on an assignment to a meeting of Red Stockings. Red Stockings was a group of young women who were much more radical in their views than women who had joined the National Organization for Women now. She also went to a hearing on abortion. And she produced in 1969 her first feminist article called Black Power, Women's Liberation. She argued it was time for women who were involved in civil rights to work for women's rights. And she began to be active, going on speaking tours with civil rights workers, becoming active in the National Women's Political Caucus, and you can recognize Betty Friedan way at the left, and Gloria Steinem is seated next to Eleanor Holmes, who also became very prominent in the women's and civil rights movement. She spoke along with a number of other women at the Democratic National Convention. And it became clear that it was time for a new women's magazine. Just the year before, there had been a sit-in at the offices of the Ladies' Home Journal by 100 women who were protesting articles that were, quote, irreverent, unstimulating, and demeaning to women, unquote, not to mention the ads. There had also been a sit-in at Newsweek where women protested the fact that they were never promoted to editorial positions. And so she and Clay Felker agreed to publish a trial issue of this women's magazine in December of 1971 as part of New York Magazine's year-end double issue. And as I told you, in a few weeks, every one of those issues of Ms. was sold out. It was clear that this should not be just a trial issue. This should be a permanent national feminist periodical that would attract a wide readership. Here is a meeting of the Ms. Magazine staff in June of 1972. You can see Gloria on the floor. That was her favorite position, on the floor, as they're discussing what to do for the next issue. And here it was. This was the first independent issue of Ms. It appeared in the summer of 1972. And they put Wonder Woman on the cover. Peace and Justice in 72 and Wonder Woman symbolizing women's political power. There were a lot of very important articles in this one, as there had been in the first one. That very first issue that I showed you had an article where women who had abortions pleaded for a change in the laws, and they listed their names. Many of them were prominent women, including Billie Jean King and Judy Collins and a whole host of writers. So this second issue had even more relevant articles to women's concerns. The timing was absolutely right. The women's movement was on the upswing. There were national women's conferences that Gloria Steinem went to. There was an international women's conference, and she found herself constantly asked to speak. She was on the road a lot. Here she is on one of her speaking tours, and I will tell you, she even came to little old Gainesville in the 1980s and spoke to a sellout crowd at one of our major venues. So not only was she speaking, she was writing. Remember that Steinem had started as a journalist. She always wanted to write, and she was serious about her writings. Here she is marching for the Equal Rights Amendment in 1978. You can see Betty Friedan again, that's Dick Gregory in the middle. A march on Washington in 1983 with Maya Angelou. And her books. They started to come out quite quickly. 1983, Outrageous Acts and Everyday Rebellions, which is a collection of essays on all kinds of topics. And then 3 years later, a very interesting book on Marilyn Monroe, which is really a sympathetic portrait of a woman who was treated like an object for financial reasons. She has continued to write, moving beyond words. It's an idiosyncratic compendium of original and unpublished essays on everything: age, power, money, muscles, you can see it all. And in 2015, not that long ago, another book called My Life on the Road, where she details all her activities, the people she met, and what she learned. She has evolved in her views over the years, and it's very evident if you look at her book. Her writings have been everywhere: magazines, newspapers, anthologies. She's often asked to comment on the latest issue concerning women. And she's active, very active, in a variety of organizations. I mentioned the National Women's Political Caucus. She's campaigned for any number of women candidates. Ms. Magazine itself has a foundation for women. They raise and distribute funds for grassroots projects that empower women and girls. In 2013, Gloria Steinem received a very prestigious honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Barack Obama. This medal is reserved for people who make a contribution to the United States in terms of national interests or cultural forces. And Gloria Steinem was very pleased to receive this. As I said, she remains active. In 2015, you may recall there was an effort on the part of a group of women who were interested in bringing peace to the world to try and cross the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. And there she is in the front of that group. You won't be surprised to hear that she was at the first Women's March on Washington in January of 2017 after the election of President Trump. And here she is the same year. The Ms. Foundation for Women has something called the Gloria Awards, and that was presented to Hillary Clinton in 2017. Recently, very recently, there was a play and a film about Steinem. In the film, 4 different women portray Gloria Steinem. In the play, for a while, it was Christine Lottie, who was playing Gloria Steinem. I believe you can still see the PBS version of that. It is really worth watching. It's most interesting portrayal of this incredible woman's life. And here she is just a few years ago, speaking at the 92nd Street Y in New York. If you're wondering about Gloria Steinem's connection to Judaism, she has said, quote, "The truth is, I identify as a Jew when there is anti-Semitism, not when there isn't. But other people regard me as Jewish." And when she was asked about the specific challenges facing Jewish women, she replied, quote, "Each individual woman knows what's best. But if God is man, then man is God," unquote. In other words, she rejects the patriarchal images of Judaism. She talks about Judaism's older, more spiritual tradition, and that's the mystical part, the Kabbalah that she's attracted to. And her quotes: "The future depends entirely on what each of us does every day. A movement is only made up of people moving." I think that's a wonderful quote. "The first problem for all of us, men and women, is not to learn, but to unlearn. When unique voices are united in a common cause, they make history." And finally, this was published just a few months ago for International Women's Day in March. It was in Variety magazine, and with this recent photo of Gloria Steinem. And this is what she had to say: "Change is slow. Like a tree, it grows from the bottom up, and we still have a long way to go. But we just need to keep going and to celebrate how far we've come. We also have fun doing it. Supporting each other and finding new ways to work is the source of day-to-day change and also of joy and community." And those are Steinem's words of advice to all of us. A woman who became an incredible symbol of the women's movement in the United States and really to the rest of the world. Hats off to you, Gloria Steinem, for all that you have accomplished. If Gloria Steinem changed our ideas about journalism and women's role in journalism and the women's movement, this woman, Judy Chicago, was a pioneer in the field of women's art, of feminist art, of art that expresses and celebrates women's experiences and women's traditional skills. She has changed the art world forever, and there's no doubt that she will be seen as one of the most important figures in the 20th century art history of the United States. She was born in Chicago in 1939. Her father was a Marxist and a labor organizer. Her parents were not religious, but her father was very proud of the fact that he was descended from generations of rabbis, and he made that known to the family. At a very early age, she liked to draw. And there you can see it, a finger painting from when she was 4 years old. She attended the Art Institute of Chicago. Her mother made sure that she had art classes. And then she went to UCLA in California and received both a Bachelor's of Arts and a Master's of Arts at UCLA. While she was there, by the way, she created posters for the NAACP. For a while, she was a successful sculptress, producing these huge metal sculptures that were kind of the rage, actually working in what was almost an auto body shop. But by 1970, she was teaching full-time at Fresno State College. And then she went on to teach at the California Institute for the Arts. She was known at that time as Judy Cohen. Here is a photo of her from 1957. She would change her name to Judy Chicago in 1970. While she was at the California Institute for the Arts, she established a feminist art program, and it became an important center for disseminating a new understanding of art based on women's history and social experience. Her partner in this was Miriam Shapiro. And in 1972, the two of them enlisted a couple of dozen art students and several local artists to create a statement. It would be called Woman House. It was actually a dilapidated mansion in Hollywood that they would take over, and they would decorate each room according to what the female students felt, what they wanted to express, and it would display a feminist point of view. As you can see, the invitation was on a lace doily, which is absolutely perfect considering what Woman House was. I mean, Woman House was a radical statement. Here's one of the rooms. It was actually showing the linen closet from Woman House. And you can see a woman's body pushed into the shelves, conveying the idea that this is almost a prison for women. This was called the Nurturant Kitchen from Woman House. If you look carefully, what's on the walls are not eggs, but women's breasts. And again, it was expressing the idea that this is what women do, they nurture. And perhaps being a homemaker wasn't as easy or as wonderful as had been pictured. Now, I have to tell you that Woman House was controversial. There is a room that was called the menstruation bathroom. It was a bathroom painted in white, and prominently displayed on the shelves were women's hygiene products. There were also used women's hygiene products displayed in the wastebasket. And when people looked at this and were revolted, Judy Chicago would talk about the fact that in many great works of art, and you all have seen them, that picture battles and war and people dying, there is blood. And that blood is considered okay, although it means death. This is women's life-giving blood. And why should women be embarrassed or ashamed about it? So she wanted to start a dialogue, and indeed she did. She was very influenced by a woman who was a pioneer in my field, Gerda Lerner, who was one of the very early women who wrote about women's history. And Gerda Lerner claimed that women needed to be aware of their history and they needed to celebrate it. So Judy Chicago, right after Woman House, began an immense project that had to do with ceramic plates and place settings. Here she is at work in her ceramic studio. And what she produced is called the dinner party. It is now permanently housed at the Brooklyn Museum. And if you haven't seen it, if you get to New York, make an effort to go see it. It is an astounding piece of art. It is enormous. It is a triangular table, 48 feet long on each side. It took 6 years to complete. It involved 400 artists who drew upon traditional women's crafts such as china painting, embroidery, weaving. They created 39 place settings on this dinner table, representing 39 women from primordial goddesses all the way up to Georgia O'Keeffe and Virginia Woolf. It sits on tiles where there are 999 other names of prominent women, and the light plays on those names in a way that they go on and off. Each place setting is meticulously done to reflect the individuality of the woman and the times. Here's one side of the dinner party table. And you can see, if you look closely, you can see the names on the tiles on the floor. For example, Isabella d'Este, who was one of the prominent women in the Renaissance. This is her plate. The plates were created by Judy Chicago, and it took a lot of trial and error to get these plates right. And you can see how the design of the plate reflects the portrait of Isabella at that time. This is the place setting for Sacagawea. Sojourner Truth, one of the most important Black women involved in both the anti-slavery and women's rights movement. You can look at the wonderful faces on this plate. Emily Dickinson. Now, you can see how feminine this plate is, and there's no doubt that there's sexual imagery in a lot of these plates. Susan B. Anthony. And by the way, as the time moved on the table, the plates went from flat to more three-dimensional. Each placemat is made with the techniques of embroidery and materials that's appropriate for the subject and the time. And as I said, the ceramic plates were often sexual. They were criticized, controversial. Someone called it vaginal sculpture. But Judy Chicago wanted to extol female sexuality and female physicality, and she did in the dinner party. It toured all over the country. Hundreds of thousands of people saw it. And as I said, it is now finally installed in the Brooklyn Museum and well worth making an effort to get there. The importance of the dinner party cannot be underestimated in the world of art. As I said, it was an immense collaborative project among hundreds of women artists. And it had an effect on them as well as on the people who saw it, because a number of the women said, you know, they thought what they did, painting teacups or embroidering or doing crocheting, was just a craft. And then they realized by being part of this project that it was not just a craft, that they were expressing their artistic ability and endeavors, and those should be honored. Judy Chicago said, quote, "To reclaim our past and insist that it become a part of human history is the task that lies before us. For the future requires that women, as well as men, shape the world's destiny. And she began another immense project almost immediately. This one, just as controversial initially, it was called the Birth Project. And in it, she wanted to express the experience of childbirth through needlework. She was fascinated with goddess stories and also interested in the fact that there weren't very many depictions of the actual birth process. And so here they are, something like the creation tapestry, which is, if you look at it, it's an evolutionary stream of life forms that are flowing from a woman's body. Insects, turtles, fish, snakes, snails, and then a flock of birds. Here's another one, the birth trinity. And finally, earth birth, where a woman is essentially giving birth to the earth. Again, this project celebrated women's traditional crafts. There are 100 needlework creations. It's embroidery, it's quilting, it's crocheting, it's smocking, it's weaving, it's macrame. It's all the things that women have done, and they are celebrated. It was done by 150 women volunteers, and it is startling to look at. Her next project, and she always does big projects, was quite different. It was called the Holocaust Project. She had gotten married in 1985. It was a Jewish wedding, and she began to explore her Jewish roots seriously. She went to Israel, she traveled in the Middle East, and then she began to research the Holocaust. She and her husband, Donald Woodman, who was a photographer, visited the death camps. They talked to survivors, and the result is the Holocaust Project, From Darkness into Light. 16 large-scale works, photography, painting, stained glass. It toured until 2002. Like everything Judy Chicago produced, it was controversial. Now here's an image. This one was called Wall of Indifference. And if you look closely, you can see on the left, people representing the 3 countries who were indifferent: Russia, the United States, and Britain, while people are being transported on trains to be slaughtered. And on the right-hand side, the Red Cross and the church. Here's a close-up from that of the train, and of course, Jew written on the train. Here's another startling image, people being fed into the ovens, and you can see the pigs hanging. In other words, very clear, people are being slaughtered like animals. Now, many critics said that for her to produce this about the Holocaust was exploiting something that was so painful, and she was using it in a way that they did not approve of, that it was being used perhaps for commercial purposes to help her become famous. She denied that. She said that her purpose here was to transform consciousness, to be part of Tikkun Olam, repairing the world. And she kept saying the Holocaust was the main event of the 20th century. And how could artists not deal with the Holocaust? And it ends, this Holocaust project ends with something called the Rainbow Shabbat, which is one of my favorite parts of it. If you look at it, it is a Shabbat with people from all backgrounds, all religions, all races, all nationalities. And so that's why the subtitle of the Holocaust Project is From Darkness into Light. After that, she did something called Resolutions, A Stitch in Time, and which she reworked traditional kinds of proverbs about family and tolerance and human rights. For example, bury the hatchet. This one, I think, speaks for itself. This is from A Stitch in Time. And she began to produce even more work with Jewish themes. This is a study for a matzah cover that she did called The Female Face of Passover. And Back to the Plates, a Seder plate in 2011. She has recently come into her own, there's no doubt about it. There was an article in the New York Times Sunday magazine just 3 years ago about her, calling her the Oracle of Feminist Art. This is a wonderful cover. It's a wonderful article, by the way. And Time magazine named her one of the most influential people in the world in 2018. And again, another wonderful picture of her. And I will tell you that she's about to publish a new autobiography. Her first autobiography was called Through the Flower. And then she revised it. And this one is coming out next month. And the foreword is by Gloria Steinem. The Flowering, the autobiography of Judy Chicago. She's publishing it in time for her 82nd birthday. It's actually coming out then. So Judy Chicago worked in a variety of mediums. She covered a variety of topics. She made the art world look at her, talk about what she was doing. She made a difference. And as a recent critic has said, Judy Chicago, quote, is now almost as much a part of American culture as Norman Rockwell, Walt Disney, the WPA murals, and the AIDS quilts. And she is getting better all the time, unquote. She changed the art world forever, a force of nature. That is Judy Chicago. And the last woman I want to talk about, Professor Deborah Lipstadt, a professor of history at Emory University. In 2005, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs awarded her its highest honor, the Albert Chernin Award, which is given to, quote, an American Jew whose work best exemplifies the social justice imperatives of Judaism, Jewish history, and the protections of the Bill of Rights. Most of the people who have gotten this award are people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Alan Dershowitz. It is unusual for a historian, a serious academic historian, to get this award. Deborah Lipstadt was born in New York City in 1947. Her father was an immigrant from Germany who left just in time. Her mother was Canadian. She grew up in a very observant Jewish home. She attended a Hebrew-speaking camp. the Hebrew Institute of Long Island. She attended a modern Orthodox Zionist school. She went to CCNY, majored in political science and history, but she spent 2 years at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. From CCNY, she went to Brandeis University, to the Department of Northeastern and Judaic Studies. She received a PhD there. In fact, she was the 100th person to get a PhD from Brandeis University. Here she is giving the keynote address back at her alma mater in 2019. She taught for a while at Washington University. She was the first to teach Judaic studies. And then she went to the University of California in Los Angeles, where she was there until 1985. She produced a book in 1993 that was well received in the academic communities. It was not a bestseller, although people who were interested in Jewish studies took note of it. It was called Beyond Belief. And it was a book that focused journalism about what was happening in Europe from 1933 to 1945, and essentially asking the question, what did Americans know about events in Europe, and how did American journalists handle it? She stayed in Los Angeles, and she was part of a vibrant, eclectic Jewish community that included Reform, conservative rabbis, and feminists. In fact, Deborah Lipstadt wrote an essay for Susanna Heschel's anthology on being a Jewish feminist. The title of her essay was Deborah Made 10, an account of being able to participate in the minyan for her father's yahrzeit. She then got a research fellowship from the International Center of Hebrew University. And this research fellowship was to explore the topic of Holocaust denial. Now, if you've heard Deborah Lipstadt speak, and I suspect a lot of you have, she will tell you that 2 historians invited her to lunch and suggested that she study the topic of Holocaust denial. This was in the late 1980s. And she literally laughed at them. She said, Holocaust denial? How can there be such a thing? The Holocaust is the best documented genocide in the world. How can you deny it? If you deny the Holocaust, that means who's wrong? Who's lying? The victims? The observers? The perpetrators? All the people in the Nuremberg trial never denied the Holocaust. They just tried to deny their active participation. So at first she laughed it off as a topic, and then she began to research it. And at the same time that she was researching this, she accepted a job at Emory University, where she established an institute for Jewish studies. She was the first director and directed it for about 10 years. Her book, Denying the Holocaust, came out, front page, favorable reviews in the New York Times and the Washington Post. Again, very well received among the academic community, but it didn't really filter into the national consciousness. She discussed specific numbers of Holocaust deniers, and she included this man, David Irving. She called him, quote, a dangerous spokesman for Holocaust denial, a Hitler partisan who bends the historical evidence to support pro-Nazi views. She said that the Holocaust deniers were wolves in sheep's clothing. They called themselves historical revisionists. They were parading as responsible academics, but really they were anti-Semitic and they were perverting the truth. Now, David Irving had long been known as a maverick British historian. This is just a small selection of the books that he had written on World War II, often with unconventional interpretations. His general theme was that any evil committed by the Third Reich was equaled by the evil done by the Allies. That any mass murder of the Jews was carried on behind Hitler's back, that he never ordered it. Until 1988, he admitted that the Holocaust had happened, but he downplayed its impact. He said the Holocaust term should be used to describe the Allied bombing of Dresden. After 1988, he joined the ranks of total Holocaust deniers. He said there were no gas chambers at Auschwitz. He gave speeches saying more women died in the back of Ted Kennedy's car at Chappaquiddick than ever did in a gas chamber at Auschwitz.
Oh, God.
So David Irving decided to sue Deborah Lipstadt and Penguin Books for libel for what she had said about him. Now, he was suing her for libel in Britain, saying his career was ruined, that publishers were spurning his works, that he had lost a lot of money. His reputation as a historian was defamed. He chose Britain because Britain's libel laws are very different than those of the United States. They favor the plaintiff. The burden of proof in this libel case would be on Lipstadt to demonstrate the accuracy of what she had written. In other words, she had to demonstrate that Irving, in denying the Holocaust, had twisted the historical evidence. Quote, I had to prove that what I wrote was not libel. I wanted a trial that proved I was right when I called David Irving a denier. Some people advised Deborah Lipstadt to settle and get it over with. After all, this is not what historians usually do. This is not what academics do, is go into a libel trial, especially one like this in Britain. But as she said, what would she do? What would be in the settlement? How many gas chambers would I settle for? What number of Jews killed should I agree to in the letter of apology? Irving wanted a letter of apology from Penguin and Lipstadt, and he wanted no more books sold and the rest destroyed. As Lipstadt said, you have to stand up for the truth of what happened. And she did. I want you to know that this legal battle went on for 5 years. 5 years. There were 3,000 pages of testimony submitted by Lipstadt's attorney. There was general agreement that there wasn't going to be a jury trial, that it was going to be held in the royal court before Judge Charles Gray, and that Lipstadt would not testify and no Holocaust survivors would testify because David Irving was going to conduct his own case. And you can imagine what he would have done with Holocaust survivors. Lipstadt said she would have loved go to the witness box, but she was advised against it. This case was seen as so important that the Israeli government released Adolf Eichmann's journals that had been kept locked up for 28 years, and a copy was sent to Lipstadt's defense team. This man was also very important, Robert Van Pelt. He was a foremost authority on Auschwitz, and he prepared and defended a 700-page report that provided historical evidence to prove the existence of the gas chambers at Auschwitz. Irving had argued that the Nazis had no systematic plan to murder Jews. It was just the result of the ordinary violence of war. There were no homicidal gas chambers at Auschwitz, according to Irving. And Van Pelt provided all the evidence. When the trial was over, Van Pelt actually took the material he had presented and he wrote a book about it. It's called The Case for Auschwitz, Evidence from the Irving Trial. The trial went on for 3 months, and the verdict was handed down in April of 2000. Judge Gray ruled in favor of Lipstadt, and he said, and I quote, "Irving, for his own ideological reasons, persistently and deliberately misrepresents and manipulates historical evidence. He portrayed Hitler in an unwarranted favorable light, principally in relation to his attitude towards and responsibility for treatment of the Jews. He is," meaning Irving, "an active Holocaust denier, anti-Semitic and racist, and associated with neo-Nazis." Here's Deborah Lipstadt after the verdict was handed down. Irving, of course, appealed, but the court rejected his appeal. Deborah Lipstadt has written a book about this called History on Trial. And you may know, you may have seen it. It was made into a film called Denial, and here she is posing in front of that. There was a second round of the Lipstadt-Irving controversy when C-SPAN wanted to broadcast a speech by Lipstadt about her book. And they wanted to have a talk by Irving to, quote, balance their coverage of the story. Lipstadt refused. She refused to appear with or debate any Holocaust deniers. And she asked C-SPAN to cancel the program. 500 historians in the United States signed a petition in favor of her, saying that, quote, falsifiers of history, quote, cannot balance history. As Lipstadt has said many times, you can have your own opinion, but you cannot have your own history. Facts are facts. C-SPAN, by the way, refused to cancel the program. At a Yom HaShoah observance in the fall of 2000, a Holocaust survivor came up to Deborah Lipstadt and said, "Unsere Deborah, our Deborah, you do not know what you did for us." Deborah Lipstadt was embarrassed by that. She said she didn't know what to respond. She had not sought worldwide publicity, but she had it from this incredible libel trial. It was a grueling experience for anyone. She has published a new book on anti-Semitism here and now. It is written as a series of letters to two fictional people. It's a composite of students and colleagues at Emory. And she talks extensively about whether today's anti-Semitism is different from the past and where it's coming from. She talks about anti-Semitism on both the left and the right. And she talks about a template for recognizing anti-Semitism and its characteristics. One of the quotes in this book has really stayed with me. Quote, "When our children fear there is danger in openly identifying as a Jew, it is indeed something that should concern us all." Absolutely true. She has given a recent TED Talk. If you put Deborah Lipstadt in your Google search, you will be able to come up with it. And just this month, she did another interview on anti-Semitism. She's constantly being asked about this book and about the trial. And I love what she said. Historians do not need to fear the truth. Deniers, it should be stressed, as was demonstrated in my trial and affirmed by 5 different judges, are not proposing an iconoclastic version of history. They twist the truth and lie about the facts. And finally, a creative, thoughtful, and accomplished people, such as the Jewish people, should be known by what they have done and not by what has been done to them. Well, Deborah Lipstadt, we know you by what you have done for us. So hats off to you, Deborah Lipstadt, and may you continue to defend the historical truth. 3 women still around today, still making their mark as rebels, radicals, and reformers. Thank you for listening. And I'm happy to answer questions or have comments.
You can't hear it, but I think there is a collective wow.
Okay, someone,
Can I say something?
Please.
Thank you so much. You're just a natural narrator, storyteller, historian. It's so interesting. And your visual aids and everything. I was just wondering, have you ever heard of a feminist writer and Professor Ann Snitto and her mother, Virginia Snitto?
no,
No, okay. Okay, she did a lot of, they both did work in Israel, and they did work, and Anne did a lot of work in the Eastern Bloc, helping them after 1989 with forming their constitution so that they were, that they observed equality for women. But she did a lot in the US too.
there are so many wonderful Jewish women.
Yes,
It's really amazing, really is.
yes, it is.
Thank you for sharing that.
Laura, did you have a question?
Can't hear you. You're muted, I think. Yes.
Her sound isn't working.
Laura, you're going to need to unmute.
Can't hear her.
Well,
Laura, you'll have to unmute.
well, she was unmuted. We could hear her, but it's a tiny, weeny little squeak.
Maybe her sound is just turned down really low or something.
Yeah.
Maybe she can just write it in the chat.
Anyone else?
I have a question.
Yes.
Where is Judy Chicago's exhibit, the Holocaust exhibit? Where can it be seen?
You know, I don't know if it's available right now. It toured for a while, but it's a good question. I'm not sure there's a permanent home to it. I'd have to check on that. Unfortunately,
Okay,
but
thank
you
you.
can find most of the images. You know, she has a website and a blog, and I mean, she's all over the internet, and you can see most of the images that way, even if it's not on permanent exhibit somewhere. Yeah, it was a long time before they found a permanent home for the dinner party, but of course that's enormous. I mean, it's an enormous piece and you have to have the space for that. The Holocaust is not, but I think the Holocaust depictions are quite amazing. I really do.
Thank you.
Anything else? Eve, I see a hand.
You'll need to unmute, Eve.
Thank you for a great program. Have you actually seen the Judy Chicago exhibit?
The dinner party, yes.
Oh, wow, must be amazing.
Well, the story is I was in New York several years ago visiting my sister-in-law who has a disability and could not take public transportation from where we were staying in Manhattan to Brooklyn. And I was so determined to see it. I hired a driver for hundreds of dollars to take us to Brooklyn and then bring us back. I had to see it in person because it's an amazing experience. I mean, you stand there as a woman and you are very moved. I mean, it's really extraordinary. So it's well worth going to see. You can buy a book. I have the book also, and it has very good reproductions. It was a hard choice for me as to which plates to show you. You know, I have certain favorites and all, but yes, it's well worth going to Brooklyn to the Sackler wing of the Brooklyn Museum to see it.
Your passion for it came through in your speaking.
Well, I had heard so much about it and was really a relative newcomer to learning about Judy Chicago. So I was determined.
Right. Thank you very much.
Anne has something to say, I think.
Barbara, what was the reception of the Irving trial in Britain?
The reception to the Lipstadt trial?
Yeah, right.
Oh, I think most British people were happy with the verdict.
Oh, yeah.
But, you know, when she started to research it, there was something called the Institute for History. It had an innocuous sounding name. And it was made up of a group of people who presented themselves as legitimate revisionist historians. And their stuff was unbelievable. And some of them were in Britain. And some of them were in the United States. And, you know, so I think the reception in general was relief that Irving was found to have been a Holocaust denier and she was held up.
So what do these deniers get from, from twisting their, from trying to twist history this way? Why would they do it?
That's a wonderful question. And I'm not sure I have the answer to it. Irving did not start out as a denier. He started out as a minimizer, I would say, saying, Anne Frank's diary was like Gone with the Wind. It was a fable. I mean, that's the kind of thing he said, but he progressed into total denial. And I think although I hate to make this generalization, if you scratch the surface, what you find are
Right.
anti-Semites.
Exactly. Yes.
You know, I'm afraid that's where it is. And they parade this institute. I mean, it was an institute and it published things. In fact, if you look up reviews of her book, when the Washington Post published a review of her book on the deniers, people then wrote letters to the Washington Post disputing the review, the favorable review of her book, and saying that the Washington Post had gotten the facts all wrong and these people were legitimate historians, etc. I mean, there was an argument carried on in the pages of the Washington Post.
Wow.
Barbara,
Yes.
isn't that eerily similar to the denial of Biden's election?
Oh, I don't know if I want to go there.
How,
Well, I mean, people twist the truth. They twist the facts for their own purposes.
how was Irving a well-respected historian? I mean, on what
Well,
basis?
he was, well, his research was good. He was seen as, what did I call him? A maverick with unusual interpretations of what had happened. So there are a lot of sources in his books, and you know, there were people who present different versions of what happened in World War II in terms of Hitler's strategy and the impact he had, and what happened at Dresden and the Allied bombing of Dresden. So he presented a lot of interesting books, and his books were well received and among certain people. I mean, he made a good living selling his books. Anything else? Yes, Goldie.
I would just share that I had the opportunity to learn with Deborah Lipstadt
Oh,
several years before the trial. So when the trial came, it was a terrifying time. There was no guarantee that she was going to win the trial. It was enormously expensive to mount the defense. And there were major fundraising campaigns all over the country to make certain that she had the very best to win the trial. It was terrifying for all of us who knew what was going on. Our hearts broke for her, and it was a horrifying time for her. She talked about it some, about how incredibly alone she felt, in spite of the fact that millions of dollars had been raised to help her. But meanwhile, she was the one who was sitting in the courtroom.
Yeah.
And was unable to say anything at the advice of her legal team.
right. Yeah, it took incredible guts and courage on her part. As I said, this isn't what historians do. You know,
And she had no idea whether Emory would support her or not. So
Yeah.
she was terrified that she was going to lose her job over the whole idea of fighting this goofbag. But
Did she ever
thankfully it all worked out.
Did she ever regret writing what she wrote about Irving?
Never.
No. Good.
absolutely not.
Excellent.
Absolutely not. Very courageous woman. And as she said, you have to tell the truth.
Mhm.
And if we don't tell the truth, we're not historians, you know. So yeah, she doesn't regret it. She talks about it. And, it is worth listening to her TED Talk and her recent interview on anti-Semitism, which was just a few weeks ago that I listened to it. She's very, very good. She has a wonderful sense of humor despite everything. But thank you for sharing that, Goldie. I mean, I can't imagine what those 5 years were like, you know, where they were collecting the evidence. And the British libel law is so strange.
It's very
know,
odd. Mhm.
by comparison with our libel laws. But, and David Irving was formidable.
Mhm.
It was, you know, so, yeah. A
And-
very
and they could-
courageous woman.
And they would take the case in Britain because these books were internationally sold, or, I mean,
He filed the case in Britain on purpose
right, I mean, but
because
they,
the libel law favored him.
but is he British?
Yes,
Oh, okay. Okay.
yeah, he's a British historian.
Her book, History on Trial, is very readable. I find myself getting lost in a lot of legal tomes, but this one doesn't read that way. So if you're interested in, you know, a little glimpse into what the trial was like for her, History on Trial gives you a small little window.
Oh, definitely.
And the movie's worth watching too, I think, don't you?
Yes.
Denial with Rachel Weisz.
I agree.
I actually didn't see them.
I
Yeah.
saw the movie. It was very,
Yeah, I think it's quite well done.
it doesn't really touch what you've told us about it, but it really will pique your interest. It's very well done.
Well, you know, as I thought about this series, I thought it's really fitting to end with a historian, and what a historian. So anyway, thank
Barbara,
you.
it has been an astounding series for us. The notes in the chat are only one small piece of the enthusiastic response from so many who have participated. And thankfully, we did in fact learn how to record. So there are several people who missed session 1 or session 2, and we're proud to say that we do have a recording. So if you're interested in either rehearing them or hearing them for the first time, we can make them available to you. And many, many thanks to you, Barbara, and of course to our underwriters who enabled all of these pieces to come together.
Yes, and I also would like to thank all the people who supported the program and came. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara.
So we're thrilled with tonight, and you all know that this is just one of the wonderful Hadassah programs, and we hope to see everyone on Tuesday mornings in July at 11 o'clock, beginning on July 6th. And for the following 4 weeks, for our July book reviews, everybody is welcome. Between now and then, stay well, keep reading, and be smart.